Hello! So, uh, I'm not sure what I'm gonna call this video yet, uh, but depending on what I title it, it might not be entirely clear what I'm talking about in this one. So, to make it clear right away, I've started reading Arcanum Unbounded, and I've specifically avoided reading three things. I've avoided reading A. Edge Dancer, which is almost certainly going to be its own video when I eventually read it. B. Any stories or novellas set on Scadrial, because I've been informed that those, or at least some of those, should be read after Bands of Mourning. And C, the White Sand excerpt, because I'm going to read White Sand like as a whole at some point, so I see no reason to read like a small excerpt now. So, what I have read are the two Selish stories, which is The Hope of Elantris and the Emperor's Soul. The one story set on Threnody, which is the incredibly titled Shadows for Silence in the Forests of Hell. And the one story set on First of the Sun, which is titled Sixth of the Dusk. So I will be talking about those stories here, and I'll really be very brief. I expect this video will be shorter than most that I've made recently. So let's get into it. First of all, I'm just going to immediately eliminate from the discussion The Hope of Elantris, because it is not interesting. It's fine. It's short, it doesn't overstay its welcome. I didn't feel any negative emotions while reading it, and the story behind its creation and the main character's name that Brandon tells in the postscript is very cute and wholesome, and it's fine. I don't mind it being here. I have no thoughts on it. Um, Moving on. The Emperor's Soul. So, The Emperor's Soul is often talked about as one of Brandon's best works. It is very, very, very highly rated. Certainly the highest rated of all of the short fiction that he's written. And for good reason. It's incredibly good. The all of the characters who are introduced in the story are developed to a shocking extent, given the very short length of the story. The magic system that is introduced is fascinating. The internal conflicts are really good, and the setup for the future is something that is very present in this story in ways that it isn't necessarily in the others here. So I get the feeling that we will be seeing more of this setting, the empire of whatever it was called. I can't remember. Um, yeah, just an incredibly good story. A couple of thoughts on it. So we have a couple of new magic systems revealed here. These are blood sealing and forging. Blood sealing being sort of like necromancy, I guess, and forging being the thing that Shy does, which is too complicated to explain. But, you know, if you're watching this, you've read the story. Um, yeah, I have a couple of questions about these magic systems. Specifically, how do they relate to the door? The reason I ask that is because Elantris heavily implied that the other magic systems on SEL, aside from Aeon Door itself, also draw power from the same source. And we find out here in the little bit at the start that there are two shards on SEL, or were, both are apparently dead, and they are called Dominion and Devotion. And my guess would be that Devotion is the one that powers Aeon Door, like devotion is the one that's tied to the magic system of Elantris, and dominion is the one that's tied to some of what we saw in Fjorden. Whether and I don't know where blood sealing and forging fall into that category, into that categorization. Um, I'm way more interested in the sequel to Elantris at this point than I was when I originally read Elantris. I feel like seeing Brandon tackle this setting with his current level of skill could be amazing. Um, Other than that, there's just a couple of small details in here that I noticed that I really liked. One was that Shy sort of casually remarks that the branding, that the not branding, the final seal that she marks her, the final mark that she sets to seal her marks, her brands, um, is in the shape of her homeland. Or rather, what she says is she'd always fancied it to look like her homeland. And that's a really nice little detail because, of course, anyone who's read Elantris knows that that's almost certainly exactly what it looks like, and that it has to look like that for a very good reason. Because that's how magic works on SEL. But in the story, it's just sort of remarked as like a cute little, oh shucks, she's so adorable. She thinks it looks like her homeland. So yeah, that was cool. The other thing I want to talk about with the Emperor's Soul is the ending. So the Emperor's Soul refuses to answer its core question, and the core question is the Emperor Ashravan that exists at the end of the story, is that really Ashravan? Is that a person? Does he have a soul? Is he real? Does he have free will? What is that? And the story doesn't answer that. And I think that's a very good choice, because this way, it sort of leaves it up to the reader and their own beliefs about the soul and continuity of self and so forth to decide whether this is a happy ending. So, for example, because of my beliefs about the soul, or rather, my lack of belief in a soul, I guess, I read this story and I view it as a straightforwardly positive story of a successful resurrection. But someone who believes in an immortal God given soul might read this story and think, oh, this is horrific. The real Ashravan is dead, and this is some sort of monstrous puppet that doesn't have his soul. And the story doesn't answer that question, and I like that. I like that that's left up to the reader. Speaking of souls, though, one thing that struck me as interesting is that Shy understands the threefold nature of the Cosmere, the um, uh, physical, cognitive, and spiritual realms, in a way that I haven't seen anyone outside of Roshar mention. Like, people on Roshar are aware of this division because their magic system, they've just studied it, basically. But none of the other worlds have ever had that mentioned explicitly. No one has ever actually said, like, oh yeah, there's like these three realms. I feel like Mistborn is getting close to acknowledging it at this point. I wouldn't be surprised if it's actually acknowledged in the Bands of Mourning, but um, aside from that possibility, I don't think it's been acknowledged outside of the Stormlight Archive so far. So that's interesting. That tells me that Shy's people, the Forgers or whatever they're called, the Forgers have a better understanding of the Cosmere's structure than probably anyone else on SEL. Seemingly better than the Elantrians, which is pretty impressive. Yeah, that's really all I have to say about that story. It was really good. A plus. Congratulations, Brandon. That was great. Shadows for Silence in the Forests of Hell. Fantastic title. Also, weirdly enough, a story I've read before. A story I read before without knowing who Brandon Sanderson was. Because this story was in an anthology that was edited by George R. R. Martin, that was titled Dangerous Women, that had a bunch of stories from a bunch of authors. I think Robin Hobb was in there, Joe Abercrombie, etc. A lot of the stories in that book weren't very good, and I don't remember the details of a lot of them. I didn't remember the details of this one, but while I was reading it, it felt kind of vaguely familiar to me. I didn't know how it would end, but I had this vague sense of deja vu while I was reading it. And then at the end, the postscript happens, and Brandon says it was written for dangerous women, and I'm like, oh, I read this like 6 or 7 years ago when I had never heard of Brandon Sanderson. I hadn't even heard of Robert Jordan back then, and Robert Jordan is the only reason I have heard of Brandon Sanderson. So I was like several large book series removed from even hearing of Brandon Sanderson at the time. So when I read this story back then, it meant nothing to me because I didn't know who Sanderson was. But I did enjoy the story. Now, when I'm reading it now, it wasn't like a particularly standout story. The magic system on Threnody doesn't strike me, at least what little we see of it here. It's not particularly compelling to me. The world building is. I do love the idea of this like people living in this cursed forest and then other people living in the forts, and sort of like the tension between those two cultures, which we don't see a lot of here, but we see little hints of it. So I do want to read more stories set on Threnody, but probably not Silence's story, because I just don't find like I think Silence is not. I think Silence is very much a one-off character created for this story. The other thing that's interesting to me about this story is that I don't think this story was originally meant to be part of the Cosmere. And the reason I say that is because there are a lot of names, a lot of proper nouns here that are very English, like they're anglophone. They feel like they come from like sort of Puritan culture, and thus far there haven't really been a lot of real world names in the Cosmere. Each of the settings for Cosmere stories has had its own unique fantasy languages and naming systems. And this one doesn't. And that strikes me as interesting. I could be wrong, but to me, it sounds like this story was not originally written for the Cosmere, or was written during a time when the Cosmere wasn't as developed as it is now. I could be wrong, but that's the feeling I get. That's fine though, because it fits. It works in the Cosmere. The names are a bit like they stand out a bit, but other than that, it doesn't really matter. Anyway, that's all I have to say about that one. And the final story I read is Sixth of the Dusk. So, if the Emperor's Soul is the best story here, which it is, don't get me wrong, it absolutely is the best in terms of skill, in terms of world building, in terms of character, in terms of everything. But this is the story that I found the most interesting personally and compelling out of these four that I read. So, first things first, for Sixth of the Dusk, I find it very cute that Brandon keeps putting parrots in stories because he has a parrot. He clearly really likes parrots. There was a parrot in Stormlight. There was a parrot in Warbreaker. And now there's a story that's like basically entirely about parrots. I mean, I know the birds aren't explicitly described, but it's pretty clear from how it's talked about that these are some variety of parrot. the quote-unquote AVR. So I find that cute. Um, but that's not really the meat of this story. Um, the meat of this story is two, in my opinion, not particularly interesting characters, Dusk and I don't even remember her name. They're fine. They work for a story this length. I'm not complaining. But the interesting stuff here is not so much them as the larger world building and themes at play here. So I'll talk about the world building a bit more in a moment when I talk about all of these stories together and what I'm gathering about the larger Cosmere plot. But the theme here, one of the themes at the end of this story, struck me as really interesting. So the final reveal of this story is that the quote-unquote ones above have essentially laid a trap for the people of the First of the Sun. They have essentially created a situation where the people of First of the Sun are going to enable their own colonization. And they're going to do this through the means of trade. They've essentially given what seems like a gift, but that gift is a metaphorical poisoned apple. And this reveal really surprised me because it's such a compelling and interesting reading of colonialism and how colonialism works. This idea that you can be colonized through nothing more than trade and diplomacy, completely consensual, and yet it is still colonization. I am incredibly curious to see more of this story. I don't think we will because the postscript says that there's no plans to ever write anything else set on First of the Sun. But it does also say that we will probably see the people of this planet, just not the planet itself, and I'll get back to that in a moment. But for now, I just want to say that I'm really fascinated by the theme of colonialism there and how it's explored. And also, I find it really interesting that the two stories in this collection that are from worlds that haven't gotten full books yet, so that's Threnody and First of the Sun, these two stories, and these two settings specifically, both have a very colonial era vibe. This one obviously it has a very strong sort of Polynesian colonial era vibe, or rather, immediately before colonialism in Polynesia, because what you have is a Polynesia that is about to be colonized. And Shadows for Silence in the Forest of Hell has a very sort of like pilgrim, Puritan, early American settler vibe. And that's interesting because that's not really a thing. I was going to say that's not really a thing that's been explored in the Cosmere before, but I guess parts of Mistborn era 2 are Wild West in a weird way. So maybe, but it's interesting that Brandon seems to be moving in the direction of that particular kind of real world inspiration with his stories a lot recently compared to earlier. And I wonder whether we're eventually going to get a larger story that more explicitly tackles colonialism as one of its main themes. I hope so. I find that to be a really compelling thing to explore in stories. But I also hope it doesn't happen until Brandon has like done a lot of research and is sure he's doing a good job representing this issue, which is very, very painful for a lot of people, obviously. So yeah, I just wanted to say that that's like an interesting similarity between these two stories I noticed. That being said, though, I need to talk about some of the Cosmere stuff in this book. So, let's start from the most obvious. First, Um, it turns out that I was wrong this whole time. The Ars Arcanum at the end of each book has never been written by Hoyd, despite the assumption I've had ever since Elantris. It's actually written by a woman named Khriss. We know nothing more about her, but apparently she exists. And she's from somewhere called Silverlight, which means nothing to me. But there you go. I'll be looking out for Khriss in future books, I guess. That's the least interesting thing, though, because I don't know anything about her. The other stuff I noticed. So, we get some Cosmere terminology here straight. We finally get a clear definition of what investiture is, which I kind of guessed. Investitures are basically the different magic systems that are all tied to the shards of Adonalsium. I still don't know what Adonalsium is, by the way. I just know that ruin and preservation and all these things are shards of it. I guess Adonalsium is God or something. Anyway, so that's one terminology that finally cleared up, and a new one. I think this is a new term that hasn't been used before, maybe, and that is perpendicularity. So perpendicularities are locations that have like strong concentrations of investiture that usually take the form of pools, and they are used for world hopping. They are what Hoyd and company used to get around. So this was the pool above Elantris, that Hoyd jumped into at the end of the book. This is, I assume, the Well of Ascension. And this is now the strange pool on the top of the island in Sixth of the Dusk, where the investiture granting parasites exist. So that's interesting. I'll be on the lookout. I don't think we've established a perpendicularity on Roshar, but there clearly is one because there are so many people on Roshar who shouldn't be right now. So I'm looking forward to seeing where they're all coming from. What else happens here? Yeah, we also get a map of the Cosmere, like the actual constellations and stuff. And one thing that struck me as interesting is that each of the worlds is part of a separate constellation, except Nalthis and Scadrial, so Warbreaker and Mistborn. And Nalthis and Scadrial are both part of the same constellation, and that constellation is really, really clearly tied to Nalthis specifically, because the shape of the constellation is a woman breathing out, i.e. using breath, the magic system of Nalthis. So I don't know if this means that Nalthis and Scadrial are going to end up being more intimately connected than other Cosmere worlds, or if the fact that they're part of the same constellation is incidental. It could be. I can't really tell either way. One other thing we find out is that that you can actually have investiture on a world without shards, without active shards, or shards at all. So first, without active shards, both SEL and Threnody are confirmed to not actually have currently existing shards. So SEL had 2 shards, Dominion and Devotion, and both were destroyed. And Threnady's shard was Ambition, which Odium killed. So, and Odium also, I think, is implied to have killed Dominion and Devotion, because back in Way of Kings, one of the little excerpts at the beginning of a chapter talked about, I believe, what Raze did on SEL or something. like that's like a specific thing that something bad happened on SEL, and it was Odium's or Raze's work. So um so I guess Odium has just been going around killing other shards. But anyway, this means that Threnody and SEL both have investiture. Definitely, SEL has like probably more investiture than any other world. Like it has so much going on, so many different systems of magic on SEL. So both of these worlds have investiture that is very much alive and active without having active shards. But it's possible that there are slivers of shards or remnants of shards or whatever they're called. I believe the word is slivers that was used in one of the books. But First of the Sun does not have a shard at all and never did. And yet there is still investiture in the form of the parasites. And that's really interesting. That means that investiture exists separate from shards. At least that's how I'm reading it so far. I don't know what the implications of that are, just something I noticed. And finally, we get to the most interesting part of this, that's revealed here. And that's space travel and aliens. So, in Sixth of the Dusk, there are the ones above. And it is mentioned at the start, Khriss mentions that the system that First of the Sun is in has multiple, the Dromenad system has multiple inhabited worlds. There are multiple worlds with humans on them. And my first thought when the ones above were mentioned was, oh, that's just one of the races from the other planets. Like, that's like the people from the neighboring planet who've just discovered space travel, who are clearly more advanced than the people on the first, and they're just sort of traveling between the worlds. And that's still a possibility. In fact, it's very possible. But the other possibility that actually Brandon himself reminded me of in the postscript is that these are people from Scadrial. Because Scadrial is, we know for a fact, going to develop faster than light travel. This is something that Sanderson has confirmed is going to be, I believe, in Mistborn Era 4, like the final phase of the Cosmere, where it goes full sci-fi, is going to feature Scadrial developing FTL travel. So it's also possible that these are people from Scadrial. Because he also mentions here that the story Sixth of the Dusk takes place chronologically long after everything else he's written for the Cosmere so far. Like, this is the latest point in the Cosmere's history we've seen so far. Which is interesting. And seems to imply what I'm saying here, which is that these are people from Scadrial. Or one of the other systems, who knows. However, the thing that's most immediately interesting to me, because I'm going back to reading the Stormlight Archive soon as I read this book and Bands of Mourning, the thing that's interesting to me is this sentence, which Khriss writes. So, the system nicknamed Dromenad has a remarkable 3 planets inhabited by fully developed human societies. There is also a 4th planet in the habitable zone. This is unique in the Cosmere. Only the Rosharan system can rival it, and there, one of the planets is inhabited solely by splinters. Okay. So that's an explicit confirmation, if I'm reading that correctly, that there are at least 2 other inhabited worlds in Roshar's system, one of which is inhabited by people, by humans, and the other is inhabited by splinters, whatever that means in this context. That's a big deal. and not something that's been even hinted at so far in Stormlight, I think. So I'm really looking forward to seeing that get developed later on, I think. I hope. The other thing that's interesting to me about that is I talked earlier about how perpendicularities are how you travel between worlds, but I believe it's also mentioned here that you can travel between worlds in Shadismar. And it's also confirmed by Khriss that Shadismar is not a Roshar thing. Like, Shadismar isn't just Roshar's version of the cognitive realm. The cognitive realm is shared. So it is possible to travel to a different world in Shadismar, but you can't actually physically transfer to that world unless there's a perpendicularity, I guess, is the implication. But you can go there in Shadismar. So I'm wondering if we're going to see some of that. I'm wondering if we're going to see Yasna or Shallan or someone else who can go to Shadismar actually visit one of the other worlds in the near future. I'm very excited for that. Anyway, this was a very chaotic video. I talked about a lot of things, and it was all very disconnected. I'm so sorry. Hopefully you got something out of it. Next week, we're going back to Mistborn with Bands of Mourning. And that's going to be the next couple of weeks. And then after that, I will be handling the rest of Arcanum Unbounded. And then I guess we're going on to, what's the name? Oathbringer. We're going on to Oathbringer, which I am most excited about because Stormlight has gotten incredibly interesting and compelling and is a strong contender for one of my favorite series right now. So I really want to read the remaining 2 books. Okay. See you all next week then. Bye.